However, bots are also something that attack the human system. And so I want you to know that our guest speaker has been very sick, but has nevertheless agreed to speak to us for a short while. I'm going to make a very short introduction. So, to introduce our guest, I want you to know that he has met one of us in person, and I think now it's time for him to meet the rest of us, I guess. As I said earlier, it is said that he has a flair for the dramatic. Maybe true, maybe untrue, but the guest was being a good sport about being secret, so without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speaker by referencing the very first tweet. On. And that goes like this. So Edward Snowden, can you hear us now?
I have a cold right now. I'll be fine. I'll live. But just I'm having a little difficulty speaking, so just bear with me. I didn't have a huge sort of planned set of remarks because you guys are in politics. I think we've all had enough of that. But just to speak generally about the dynamics that we've seen when we talk about surveillance, when we talk about conflict, when we talk about economy, when we talk about whistleblowers, the active revelation, when we talk about the publications of the press and how they're increasingly coming under attack in areas that we wouldn't expect. This is the story of the last century in places like Russia and China. But now we're seeing the president of my country, in the United States, start to call journalists the enemy of the people. It's alarming because what a time we're living. By any metric, we've never been safer or freer or more comfortable. And yet it feels like with each day, when we look online, when we open a newspaper, when we turn on the television, that we're moments from the brink of an epic catastrophe, doesn't it? And all of us who are what I would like to call high information consumers, who are involved in the process, who care about this, all of you are here because you want to make a difference. You see what's happening, and you want to do something about it. You feel this new atmosphere of fear that's rolling in over the world in these last few decades, and it really seems to be catalyzing into something that's accelerating. Now, I believe this is because today, even in the safest place, in places like Iceland, by the end of every evening, the very worst thing in the farthest corner of the earth in that morning is made to light the living rooms of everyone's homes. And this is because fear is the strongest sales emotion. Fear gets clicks, right? Fear gets a response. Fear gets engagement. Fear gets people bought on whatever it is. But this abuse of fear as a communications technique has social costs that I think are becoming ever more apparent with each day. Now, used in bad faith, this fear paralyzes dialogue, right? It creates a presumption of bad faith that makes contrary propositions suspicious And because of that, it makes persuasion, which is what we should all be here to do, so difficult that it becomes something close to impossible. That is why in the United States, we're actually having difficulty convincing the president that Nazis are actually bad. And that should be a joke, but it's not. This is why people falsely believe, even though it originated in the Nazi propaganda of Joseph Goebbels in the last century, that if they have nothing to hide, they have nothing to fear. And if this were sort of a longer format, I would try to turn this around and scare you guys. I would talk about sort of the cyber threat that we're talking about, the rise of that surveillance, the empowerment of intelligence communities. But you don't need that. That's not what you're here for. It's to talk about what we can do about it. And the bottom line is I don't have the answers, and I'm not going to pretend to have the answers. But I think we all have ideas. And the one that is most central to me, the one that actually drove me forward, the reason that anyone knows my name, is because I think we eventually become acclimated to fear. We recognize the danger in it, and we can to reduce its impact on us, right? I'm not going to ask anybody to be fearless. I'm not fearless. I was scared as hell before. Now, I think we all should be. That's a natural thing. But we have to learn to use that fear for something more. We have to learn to convert it into another type of energy. It can be a motivating force, right? But that can't be the end of the decision tree. That can't be the end of our thinking. And all too often it is. We're told today, right, when we're thinking about politics in any country, right, not just talking about the pirates, but reform is the language that we should be using. Because revolution, right, revolutionary politics is scary. It's a turn. It makes people turn away. It makes them think you're not serious. It makes them think you're crazy. But perhaps when you start to look at the way things are going, changing the color of the tablecloth is not going to get us where we need to be. And perhaps this kind of revolution can happen not first in politics, can happen not first in policy, forgive me, but in the way we talk about things, in the way we present ourselves, the way we actually lead through our ideas. And great, that's very abstract, that sounds wonderful. But what I mean here is we have to be aggressive in contesting. We have to call it out when we see it from political leaders. And this is a dangerous thing, particularly when we have these dynamics like terrorism that sporadically occur. They are a real threat in that, this isn't invented, this does actually take lives, it is something problematic. But when we look at it in actuarial terms, when we look at it in terms of the impact on society as a whole, self-driving cars will save far more lives than any counter-terror strategy from the finest minds on earth with unlimited budget and unlimited power. Terrorism is a threat, but it is a rare one. Now, just to summarize, because we don't want to take all day, the idea that I think we have to do in this is recognize that we are all afraid, particularly in the political space, when we're talking about of being seen as soft in response to these threats, at least in the communities in the United States and Western Europe that I'm generally sort of fighting the battle. There is nothing more lethal to a political career than to be seen as soften crime, soften national security, soften defense, and soften God knows what else. Perhaps things are a little bit more rational in your side of the world, and one can only hope. What a blessing that would be, but there are still challenges, I think, no matter where they are, because this rhetorical technique of fearing people up is so powerful, it's so universal. And I think this is where we need to start teaching people what to do with fear. We need to become people who teach people again how to laugh at fear, or at least in the face of it. It's not that we, don't feel fear, but that we need to recognize there can be an empowering response rather than a disempowering response. We need to recognize the sources of fear. We need to look for them. We need to look at people spreading them. And we need to teach people how to hunt them down and eat them. Not the people that feed it. Probably deserve no better if we're being honest. And this is the idea. We have been victimized and terrorized for my generation's entire political wings. And we need to start thinking about post-sphere politics and how to get there. With this, I'll sort of cut my comments short and say, does anybody have any questions while we have it? Also, one more thing before we get into the questions. One of the reasons that I admire this party is one of those things where we talk about reform versus revolution is an intellectual property. You guys are doing a lot of thinking there that I think is really valuable and we really need to see some solutions on. So please keep at it. The world couldn't need it more.
I know you're sick, so if you're okay with it, we're just going to have a couple of questions from people. Yeah? Anyone have a couple of questions? We can start here.
Hi, my name is Sunna. I'm an MP for the Pirate Party. First of all, thanks so much for coming here, and also thank you so much for everything that you have done for freedom of information in the world and for the recognition of what is going on everywhere. Just thanks so much for that. In your speech, you spoke about something that we've been talking about for a while, and we are very interested in figuring out, and that is how to prepare for the future and how to work against this sort of crackdown of our rights that is happening right now. And I think you have an excellent point when you talk about sort of overstepping fear and getting over that. And what I've been thinking about a lot, and I think what a lot of activists have been thinking about a lot, is how do we, as sort of liberal movements that want to respect everyone's human rights, figure out a common narrative, a simple one that recognizes that people can be afraid, and there are reasons to be afraid, but one that looks to the future, one that is a bit more optimistic than the worldview that we get presented with every day, but is simple and approachable for people in all walks of life, not only nerds like us, but also people that are just living their lives and going about their day-to-day business. This common narrative. Do you have any thoughts on that? What could be sort of the building blocks of a common narrative, and how could we bring together more movements to find that narrative that is clear and appealing to more people? Thank you.
Thank you. This is a good question. It's a really hard one, though. Again, I want to say I don't have the answers. I'm not a politician, I'm an engineer. But the way that I look at this is one of the beautiful things about small parties is that you can take risks, right? You can experiment. And this is actually, I think, a little bit of a challenge for you guys because you're starting to get traction, right? More people are appreciating you, more people are identifying with you. God willing, soon we'll take over and we'll see things change. But the idea here is that if you have just a few people in your party that sound crazy, they're going to paint the whole party as crazy using the comments of those people. So sort of as you get more traction, this is just me speaking as an engineer, not as a career politician, so again, this could be entirely wrong. You've got people who start to moderate, and they probably, maybe should moderate for that success. But the people that you identify in the party who have, excuse me, almost heretical ideas, things that are different, that are outside mainstream, but maybe are provocative when they work, maybe to lead things forward. Maybe these people should take a turn as an independent, where it's clear that they still identify, they still have allegiances, they can try these things out. Right? Because what we need more than anything else right now is we need iteration. We need people to try things and be willing to stake their political careers on it not working. And I think the more established people become, the less likely this is to occur. Because let's be real, right? Regardless sort of moral we are, or how pure we are, or how good we want to be, we become accustomed to their lifestyles. We become accustomed to having the camera point towards us and listen to us, for example, as we start to do this more. We want to be a part of the game that moves things forward, but somebody somewhere has to be willing, not just to say something, not willing to say they believe in something, but to actually stand for something. And if it doesn't work, to take the hit. Now, when we talk about these common narratives, the thing that I've been saying again and again, which is kind of to my detriment, given that it's one of the sort of levers of influence, few levers of influence that I actually have, is people want to heroize me. Again and again, they want to say, you're a hero, or they want to villainize me on the other side and say, you're a traitor. My response to this is, nobody should care. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter whether I'm the best person on earth. It doesn't matter whether I'm the worst person on earth. Because once we start getting into these dynamics, what we're doing is we're creating different classes of people that aren't normal. Right? When we think about normal kind of political messaging, when we think about normal kind of political campaigns, storytelling, myth making, however we want to sort of go about this in culture after culture, you know, they show the dramatic, cinematic film footage of this person in slow motion as someone narrates what they've done. They play sort of the epic, you know, orchestral music that really pulls at the heartstrings. And all the time, this is raising up the action that this person has done, at the same time that it is distancing the audience from them to create sort of an emotional gap that makes this person seem more incredible. What we need to be doing to contest fear is entirely the opposite, actually. What we need to do is focus on how ordinary these people were. That there are no heroes, right? And that there are no villains in sort of the categorical sense, right? These terrorists are ordinary, useless, worthless bastards, right? 9 times out of 10, these guys aren't criminal geniuses, and I know because I've read their emails. These are people who had very limited, largely, there are outliers like Bin Laden, right? But largely, these people have very limited access to education, resources. They feel politically disenfranchised. They have no jobs. They have no opportunities. In many cases, they have limited literacy. And so their worldview, their ideas of political expression become very limited. They're angry at someone, they want to hit someone. That's the beginning and end of the conversation. Then one of these other larger figures goes, well, I can think of a way for you to hit someone harder, right? This is not, this cataclysmic villain of the universe. This is a sad, hopeless person. This is a person who, in a better world, could have been intercepted right before this kind of thing happened. And I don't mean thrown in a hole in Guantanamo. I mean going, look, really? This is what you think will get you eternal paradise? Like, think through this for a minute. And I'm not going to say that it's this easy. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that. But it's simply to point out that on the side of terrorism, it's actually the same thing. When we start talking about people and going, oh, these people who gave these great speeches, oh, these people who changed our politics of the day, are as much products of the moment. They're as much elected by circumstance as they are by individual merit. Now, this is not to downplay the fact that many of these people do have qualities, right, that made them particularly charismatic. They had a rhetorical thing. Obama, who was sort of the darling of the planet for a very long time, and many people would very much like to see him back, despite all of the wrong he did, simply because you could understand him, right? You could see where he was coming from. He could express himself, he could try to persuade people, and even when he didn't do it successfully, you understood his argument, at least. Now we have the opposite on so many scales, where we have someone who's not only not a decent person, he's not a persuasive person, he has no original ideas, he has no original thoughts. It really has no value of anything. And this is the sort of man who has never known love that he has not had to pay for. You know, the idea that we want here is not to make news, right? It's to actually make things better. When we ask how do we make these common narratives, I think the first thing there, the central idea there, is we have to focus on the commonality. You have to think about the things that you're talking about, right? That not just in sort of the poll-tested PR way, like resonate with people, right? But the kind of things that people could see themselves doing, and the things that people hope for, even in small ways, even if they think it's impossible, right? Show them in small ways how it can be possible. Show them the first step of possible. Make them dream, make them hope, make them eventually believe, and you've started to win.
Ed, do we have time for the last question, or how do you feel? Yeah?
Sure, let's do one more.
Okay, we'll do one more question.
Hey Edward, it's an honor to be standing here and asking you these questions, or this question. You talked about ideology, and I've been working with these centralized political groups that are working for a certain cause. There are always morals involved when it comes to decentralized unpolitical groups. Maybe you get a person that's working within the group that you're trying to bring down. And the morals come down to the information that you get and how you use it. Sometimes the people are not ready to keep away the information and let you use it. So it becomes difficult because it can be tracked back to them, and you know how that is. So when it comes to conversion and giving people tools to fight back, what do you think about these morals? Like if you have information that somebody else gave you that is significant, but you know that it could hurt the other person, like how do you deal with that moral obligation?
This is an incredibly difficult question. I actually don't want to answer it in a direct way because I'm not sure how I feel about it. The way that I looked at it, and was on the other end of the barrel of a gun, is I didn't give the journalists any information about me or information theoretically that could really do until I had already taken steps to protect myself. And this is ultimately sort of the core challenge of whistleblowing, and whether we're talking politics, how do you manage that source-journalist relationship? It doesn't have to be a journalist, it can be a publisher, it can be a party, whatever. And get this out there in a way that, again, is sort of morally sound. And I don't know, I think we need to normalize things in a different way. I think we need to, if we're gonna take that step, we have to make sure that people need to accept that when they're sharing this information, they are losing control of how it can be shared onwards. Now, this traditionally is how communication works. Even when we talk about it on the surveillance side, right? Now, let's say I use the best, most perfectly secured systems on there. And, I'm pretty careful about this. Obviously, we have a certain hand. But the thing is, whenever I talk to somebody else, right, whenever I talk to my lawyer, the U.S. American Civil Liberties Union, whenever I talk to you guys right now, what about the laptop that's sitting on the table that we're communicating through right now, right? What if that was hacked? What if it's not? What if my laptop is hacked, right? There's two ends of each communication where these things can go outside of our control. What if somebody in the room is, recording audio clips of this or whatever, and they're going to cut it out of context and make us all look like terrible infidels or something like that. This is the way the world works, right? But we don't want to be exploitative. I would think. We want to be better than that. We want to do things in a better way. And I would think the way on this is you honestly have to respect the source's wishes. And if you want them to come out with this, I don't think it's right to expose them. Unless they are truly involved in something that's criminal or immoral to the extent where the harms that are risked in that context that are borne by this institution or this person or whatever are outweighed by the public benefit of actually revealing this information. And that's kind of the sort of, in the short term, what happened with the NSA revelations, or global mass surveillance in 2013. But the idea here is, to the maximum extent possible, you want to think about mitigating the risks. You can never dispel them entirely, right? Particularly when you're talking about publication, particularly when you're talking about mass communication. And this is what the government does quite well, at least large, organized governments in superstates like the US, where they've got more or less unlimited propaganda budgets. When I came forward, the first thing that they did, in my case, the first thing that they did in the Iraq war logs or the Afghan war diaries case, diplomatic cables, that's WikiLeaks stuff before. The Pentagon Papers in the 1970s, the warrantless wiretapping program of the Bush administration, which was revealed in 2005, which the New York Times could have published before the election, but did not at the request of the White House. All of these things, the very first argument that the government made was that lives could be lost, damage could be caused, right? And they're not wrong. They're weighing those risks completely inappropriately, intentionally, right? The risks in each of these cases were, in fact, vanishingly small. We know this from the WikiLeaks cases because these guys eventually published with no redactions whatsoever. And yet, at Manning's trial, years later, in 2013, instead of 2009, the government was specifically asked by the court to show evidence of harm, right? Show us somebody who was disappeared, show us somebody who was killed, show us a program that was harmed, show us anything like that. And the government declined. And had they had this evidence, they almost certainly would have provided it. In my case, of course, they said the same thing. They said terrorist attacks were going to go through. They said, things were going to go dark. The oceans were going to boil off. The skies were going to catch fire. And none of this happened. In 2017, we've never seen the faintest evidence of this. And the idea here is that while these things are possible, they're not probable. Because when people are publishing this information, that's not their goal, right? And they're typically careful to try to mitigate these risks. And we've seen now sort of more, shall we say, robust publication in the case of WikiLeaks, where nothing was redacted, in a case such as myself, where only the journalists made publication decisions, nothing was ever published in full, and things were redacted. And I've been criticized for that, perhaps rightly, by people who said we were too careful, we were too restrictive, and people should know more. But the idea here is that when we look at these, excuse me, when we look at these things as sort of a spectrum, and we see in both circumstances, with very different methods, with very different approaches taken, the outcomes were identical. No one was harmed even years later. You start to see what's actually happening there when the government goes to that first argument of harm is possible. And where we as the public, where we as society fail to respond adequately, the proper response is, yes, of course, but what you're trying to talk about are the theoretical risks of journalism rather than the concrete harms of your policies, which are established by these stories. And I would say that this is the central idea that you want to start looking at these things. What are the harms that you can quantify? What are the harms that are probable rather than possible? And when you start talking about exposing something that will probably cause harm to its source, you need to be very careful indeed.
So thank you so much being sick and coming and speaking to us, the Icelandic Pirate. After all, Victor, one of our deputy MPs, whispered something to me when I was handing the mic, and I think it's on all of our minds. And it's a quick yes and no before we say get well. Ed, would you accept Icelandic citizenship?
In a heartbeat. Hopefully.